Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I am Sarah Ann Minkin, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Foundation. Today is September 3rd, 2023, and I am truly delighted to be here with Yuli Novak, the new Executive Director of the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem. B'Tselem, formerly B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, is one of Israel's premier human rights organizations and a longtime partner of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. And Yuli is a longtime partner and friend also. Yuli, I want to start. You've just taken the helm at B'Tselem. You've had a very interesting path on your way there. First of all, thank you for being here today. Thank you for taking the time. And will you introduce yourself, please, to the Foundation for Middle East Peace audience? Tell us what you think is most important for us to know about your background and your experience.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to speak to you. What is most important to know about me? So I'll just tell you a bit about myself and about the journey that brought me into this current position. So I live in Jaffa. I'm now in my home with my partner, waiting for our first child to be born any day now. I was born and raised around Tel Aviv in Israel, in a very, I would say, very Zionist, very patriotic environment. What we would call the Zionist left or liberal Zionist, maybe, environment, with a lot of deep connection and a lot of love to this country and this place. But at the same time, in a very, very liberal, very open, and I think quite aware, politically aware environment. Like as a child growing up in the 80s and 90s, I think I was not much more politically aware than most of the kids around me. Having said that, somewhere in my 20s, I found out that although I thought I was politically involved, there are many things I don't know, and most of all, I got to know slowly and a bit better what today I think is maybe the most crucial or essential part of our political life, of our existence here, and that's the occupation and the treatment and the relation between the state of Israel and the Palestinian people. So slowly, I won't go into that, but that happened during my 20s and brought me towards the end of my 20s, and it was 2012, to join the organization Breaking the Silence as a director. And I was the director of the organization for 5 years, quite hectic times. On a personal level, it was a time in which I once again learned that I don't know anything, basically, or that all that I thought I knew about politics, about how this occupation machinery is working, is just like the tip of the ice, and that this system is much more complex and have deeper roots in our political existence. So that was the first thing I think while I was directing Breaking the Silence is to get to know the occupation. And the second crucial thing that happened during those years is that somewhere around 2015, 2016, what today I would call, and a lot of people call, a major crackdown on civil society, on human rights organization in Israel happened. And Breaking the Silence at the time was one of the organizations that was in the center of this governmental attack, and yeah, it was a combination of a few levels, and it wasn't unique to Israel. I mean, we know these phenomena from other places as well. So So it was also a time for me to acknowledge some, or to face, not to acknowledge yet, but to face some of the dynamics of what happened in a country, in society that go through changes, that loosen some of its democratic features and go into more autocratic nature, and to really feel it, like to experience it from really a first-hand experience. I left Breaking the Silence, it was 2017, and I was quite exhausted and burned out. It's also something that happened to activists, mostly in an environment that changed so rapidly. But also I had a very, very strong feeling and knowing that I have to go through a journey to deepen my political understanding of what's going on. And that's basically what I did since then. So I spent about 6 years moving in, I would say, two paths that are not separated. One is to develop my political understanding of this space that we're living in. And the other one is to develop my, I would call it, strategic understanding of how to make a political change, and how do you act if you want to make a political change in this dynamic and very asymmetric environment. What tools we can use, what it means to build a strategy in this kind of environment, and so on. Basically by chance, but maybe not by chance, I found myself in South Africa and spent a few years there. So I did some work with activists, Israeli and Palestinian activists, both here in Israel, Palestine, but also abroad and mostly in South Africa. Research, writing, thinking a lot and learning about the nature of the regime that works here, the political structure that we have here, and got to the conclusion that I think to identify it as apartheid is the right way to identify it. So that was also kind of a political move for me. Quite not an easy one, we can talk about it. And after a few years of doing this kind of work, involved, but also a bit from afar, and as things are changing very, very fast on the ground here, it got to be harder and harder for me to stay far. And that's what brought me to B'Tselem, basically, and back to the field.
Great. Thank you for all of that. It's good to hear about your journey and your trajectory. And it was also interesting just to note, and I almost want to say this for the people in our audience listening. I feel like I can hear the question that some people are asking. Since you started to describe your political journey basically in your mid-20s, you skipped over the period in which you served in the IDF. Will you just tell just for our audience a little bit about that piece of your life, not in too much detail, but that?
Yeah, sure.
About that piece.
Yeah, you're right. I haven't thought about it. I didn't plan it, but you're right that I skipped it. I guess I'm not very proud of it, today. Maybe that's part of it. But yeah, I served from the 2000 2005, the years of the Second Intifada. I served at the Air Force. I was an officer. Did few positions there. And part of for me, it wasn't really a question whether I should go into the army or not. Refusing was not really an option. Not that I couldn't. It wasn't an option. It wasn't something that I thought of. All my friends, all my family, it was an obvious thing to do. And also, I couldn't see a contradiction that today is very clear to me in serving the Israeli army and my political position. And maybe then there wasn't a big contradiction. I truly believe that the system, the Israeli system as a whole, is a democratic system, and that there is the occupation that is something that we can fix, and that is wrong and should be fixed. And in that sense, to serve the army wasn't a bad thing. It was just I should go, I should do it, I should do the best that I can. Again, today I feel and I think differently about that. But I think part of the strength of this kind of political systems, and specifically apartheid, is that there are some things that you take for granted that are not even a question. Like, you really need to go through something in order to start asking yourself those questions. So yeah,
thank you for that. And if we were having this conversation 10 years ago when you were at Breaking the Silence, we would speak, I think, much more about your understanding of the role of the IDF and what it asks of its soldiers and what it represents to the country. And but here we are, 20 years after your service, almost, and you have been through many layers of your own transition and trajectory, and arrived at this place you just described to us, where both you felt this urgency to come back and be in the field, and you've taken this position at B'Tselem, and also you've spent the last few years really honing and sharpening your own analysis of what is necessary, what is possible at this point from a strategic place. And so I want to ask you specifically about the work of B'Tselem. B'Tselem, founded in 1989, so active since 1989 in documenting and monitoring and publicizing human rights abuses in the occupied territories. And here we are now with the annexation of the West Bank speeding along, really picking up speed, accelerating this accelerated dispossession of Palestinians and violations of their human rights. So from 1989, the moment B'Tselem started, here we are in 2023. What is the mandate of B'Tselem at this moment? Like, how do you see the work of B'Tselem at this moment in time?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, because I think it relates to B'Tselem, but it in a way it's even wider question, because it has to do with what is a human rights work in this kind of changing environment, right? So so I would say the basic role of B'Tselem haven't changed. It is to show reality as it is, and as you said, like to shed light on violations of human rights and abuses of human rights, in a ways to give voice to the one that doesn't have it or can't have their voice heard. So even when the situation changing, I think the basic element of the work stays the same. At the same time, the challenges are changing dramatically, and the environment that we're working is changing dramatically. And I believe that part of the obligation that organization like B'Tselem, any human rights organization has, is to keep learning about these changing realities and adapt to it. And because the ultimate goal is to make things better, right? It's not just, we're not doing it just to show off, but to really change reality. So you have to adapt to whatever is going on. And I think B'Tselem in the last 10 years, under the leadership of Hagai Elad, did some, and even started before that, made some huge steps in the sense of the way we understand reality and the way as the organization understand reality and the organization understand its role in the face of it. So moving from understanding, and I said it before, that what we're dealing with is not a democracy that runs occupation, but that there is one system. The occupation is the military occupation over the West Bank and Gaza is part of it, but that the Israeli political system as a whole is basically oriented into keep Jewish superiority over Palestinians. And in that sense, the abuses of human rights is an outcome, a necessary outcome of this system. So the move wasn't made in a day. It was a process, starting with like a process of stop working within the system and trying to fix it, like by filing complaints to the Israeli judicial system or the army itself. Stop waiting for the army to investigate itself, but acknowledging the fact that it's not. Shedding light on how the court system, the Israeli court system, either that of the army and the civil one, even Israel's Supreme Court, is basically working to preserve the occupation in a way to preserve the violation of human rights of Palestinians, and more than all to preserve Jewish superiority in this space. And I think that it was a journey that the organization went through. And early in 2021, a paper came out with a position paper of the organization identifying and explaining why we see the Israeli regime, first of all, one regime between the river and the sea, not as two separate systems, right? One is the democratic Israel, one is the occupying Israel over the West Bank and Gaza. It's one regime, it's one system, and its logic, and that's, I think, the important thing. Its logic, basic logic, is to preserve and promote Jewish rights and Jewish superiority. It's like how to say it, but that's what it is. And I think that's for B'Tselem. I feel very comfortable to say it because I didn't do it. That the organization did it way before I joined. It's quite a courageous move to make. So if to go back to the role of B'Tselem in that sense, I think once we understand that in order to protect, if I'll say the other way around, violation of human rights are outcome of this sort of regime, which we identify as apartheid regime, in order to make sure that the human rights are going to be saved and protected, we have to dismantle this regime. It's not about fixing it to be a better apartheid regime. Apartheid regime, once you acknowledge it, there is no way to make it better. You just have to change into a democratic one. And this is a fundamental change. And I think this is part of the mission that B'Tselem has now, is to help as much people as we can to understand this reality as it is by showing what it does to people, to humans. Yeah.
Thank you. What does it mean to dismantle the apartheid regime?
To change it into a democratic one. It is quite simple, you know. It's not. It sounds like I know both talking about regime sometimes sounds very like radical and extreme. The word itself, I find it, even in Hebrew, mishtal, is like a big word. And many people, when they hear this word, again, I think in Hebrew, in English, in other languages, the connection is into something bad, right? Something that is negative. But no, when I say regime, it's just I mean the system, not the specific government, but the system with its logic, with its intentions. And I mean, democratic regime is also a regime, and it's a good one. So it's not. So yeah. So when if you agree with me, or if one is willing to identify what we see here, what is going on in Israel, Palestine as apartheid, when I'm talking about dismantling it, to replace it with a democratic one, the one that is just, the one that is not racist, that doesn't aim to promote rights of one group over the other. Again, it sounds big, but it's quite. I think it's quite simple. The thing is, to get there mentally is super hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To acknowledge it is super. I know from a personal experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I want to just point out for our listeners a couple of things, a couple of resources. We did a conversation on the concept of Jewish supremacy, what it means out of different, when different people use the term Jewish supremacy and how people talk about it. And Orly Noy was one of our guests in this conversation. Orly is a writer and a translator, a political activist, and she is also the board chair of B'Tselem. And I will put a link to that conversation on the homepage for the conversation that Yuli and I are having right now, because thinking about the different contours of what it means to talk about Israel as a Jewish supremacy, or the regime as a supremacist regime, or as Yuli is talking about now, that is a regime that works to preserve the rights of one people over another. I think it's really worthwhile to sink into what we mean when we use this term, what different people mean. And now we had that conversation before the last election, just in the run up to it, when there were actual avowed Jewish supremacists running. Now those people are ministers in the government, Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Everybody calls them Jewish supremacists sort of freely. But there's a bigger question here, which is, what about the regime as a whole? And Orly talked with a lot of nuance and sensitivity about what it means when you're talking about even people in labor and merits as promoting a Jewish supremacist regime, when you have actual Kahanists who are really sort of very, very proud and explicit Jewish supremacists. How do we talk about a regime where there's a range in terms of the explicitness of how people embrace this idea, but actually the whole regime, as you were just telling us, Yuli, and as B'Tselem's apartheid paper so clearly lays out, the whole regime is premised upon promoting and preserving and protecting the rights of Jewish people above all other rights. So that's one resource, and we've also we luckily, when Chagai Elad ran B'Tselem, he was we had him on this podcast many times to learned so much from him, including to talk about B'Tselem's decision around this 2021 paper to declare the regime from the river to the sea apartheid. So I want to ask you a little bit about that. So B'Tselem became the first Jewish Israeli human rights organization to make the case that Israel is practicing apartheid between the river and the sea. There is one regime here. As you're talking, Yuli, it's not a democracy and an occupation. There's one regime between the river and the sea. B'Tselem made this case. This is apartheid in 2021. And I wanted to ask you, now we're in 2023. How do you see the impact of B'Tselem's work on apartheid, the impact in terms of the work in the world, and also of B'Tselem's work in the world, and also in terms of how different audiences perceive and understand the Israeli government and the Israeli regime overall?
Well, again, it's a good but hard question, right? Because impact in those things, like it's really hard to measure. I think that the discussion around or the discourse of apartheid is wide. Acknowledging Israel as apartheid state is widening. That I mean we can see it. It's I think that's a fact. And I think B'Tselem and other organizations can take some credit for it. I mean, for pushing this understanding, this analysis of reality forward. You know, the impact or the outcome of this is, I don't know, it is happening like gradually, but you know, there is something about acknowledging apartheid. I said it before, and I think once you acknowledge it, once you agree to acknowledge the Israeli regime as apartheid regime, the answer of what to do with it is quite simple, because there is no place for this kind of regime in the world. I mean, you either say, okay, we are willing to be that thing, or if not, so you have to change it. It's not something acceptable that you can live with. That there is an excuse of why we are doing that, and that's unlike the occupation as practice. That Israel for a long time, in a very non-convincing way, but Israel for a long time, and still is in a way, trying to make the case that it is a security thing. It is, we're obliged to. It's temporary. It's so there is kind of a space for discussion. Again, not that I believe any of it, but there is. But once you understand that this thing, that's the real thing, it is what you see, and that logic behind, you understand the logic behind it, and you identify. And again, just you said it, and you said Oli talked about it, but you know, in when I say the logic of the apartheid regime, or in Jewish superiority, and we see throughout the years. In 2018, 5 years ago, the state nation law that was so it was said very clearly, and in this government, the founding guidelines of the government is saying it even more clearly, marking that the Jewish people have an exclusive right over the entire territory of the land of Israel. So it is something that, you know, we don't need to look for anymore. Though Israel is, unlike South Africa, doesn't use the word apartheid, because in South Africa they were quite proud of it. Apartheid wasn't a bad thing, right? It was just a system. So Israel doesn't use the word, but it's doing all the rest in order to make it happen. So I'm saying, acknowledging it, I think that's in a way, that's the ultimate goal. That's the impact. It doesn't, you need to work hard in order for because politics, because power, balance of power in the international, the geopolitical balance of power, we need to work hard in order for people to be willing to acknowledge it. But that's on the global or more geopolitical level. I think in the local level, it's even local Israeli society, in a way, it's even harder. Because again, I know from my personal experience, there is a mental barrier as Israeli to acknowledge this thing. There is something about, you know, even to grow up as a leftist, as someone that is quite critical to the practices of my country. There is something about thinking about the occupation and the settlers in the West Bank and Gaza. That's the problem that keeps you, it doesn't touch something like substantial about who you are. I can still be Israeli. I can still be very proud and loving for my country, my democratic country. And the problem is somewhere else. It's beyond the green line. It's the violent settlers. It's them. It's not me. And once you acknowledge that the problem is the regime, and that I am definitely one that part of the group that has the advantage in this sort of regime, the privileged side of things, and that I also live under apartheid. It's not something that happened only there. It happened just here, right now, all the time. That says something about myself. About myself, about my family, about the environment I grew up in, about the things I love, and that they are part of me. You know, you talked about the army. For me personally, it was a totally different thing to understand what the Israeli army is doing in the occupied territories, and then to understand that it is actually an army of a political system that is very unjust in its base. So you have to let go of a lot of things that are really part of you, and to take responsibility in a whole new way. And I think that is something that for Israel is much harder to do. I understand that. I know that for me it's much harder. But once you're there, things make much more sense. That's maybe the good news. They are terrible. Things around here are terrible, but it makes much more sense. It's just more coherent. And I think today more than ever, we have the opportunity to speak to Israelis about the nature of this place is bigger than ever, because something about it showed itself. Ben Gvir, you said it, but Ben Gvir is not a phenomenon that came out of nothing. It is an extreme phenomenon. It is unthinkable that this guy, who really is the poster boy for this Jewish superiority, settler violence, and he's the minister responsible of the police. It's like, every time I say it, I'm like, nah, cannot be true, right? But so I think more and more Israelis asking themselves how we got here, how the hell we got to this place, and that's a very good. I mean, it's a terrible place to be in, but mentally, but I think it's also an option to start to ask yourself a really hard question, but what we did till now that brought us here.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for all of this conversation about what it looks like to name what's going on around you, and to look at to look at all of the signs and what the regime says about itself, like the nation state law in 2018, or the coalition agreement just now for the new government, and the political opportunity in that. But I want to ask you, actually, I want to go back to ask you a very specific question about B'Tselem and the work that you do. So B'Tselem's work is, or the heart of the work is documenting human rights abuses, collecting information. And B'Tselem is known for its rigor. It's known, it is deeply trusted because the research is so rigorous and so careful. And I wanted to ask you about the conditions now for doing this kind of data collection and monitoring and reporting. We are in an unprecedented moment of settler violence, specifically of settler violence against Palestinians. And B'Tselem says settler violence is state violence, equals state violence. Not just B'Tselem says that, we know that, but if any listeners go to your website, and I recommend they all do that, they'll see all over the website, settler violence is state violence, and incident after incident of settler violence that is being enabled one way or another by the state. explicitly by the state. And so I want to ask you specifically about B'Tselem's field workers. So B'Tselem is a staff that is both Palestinian and Jewish, and your field workers are Palestinians who live in the occupied territories, who live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza. What are the challenges that B'Tselem's Palestinian staff are facing right now, particularly in doing this work?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right in that respect. That's the main thing that B'Tselem is doing, and that's the base of our work, no doubt. And also I think in a way the legitimacy of this organization existence, right? Because again, it's about documenting and showing something that is meant to be hidden, or that is meant to be not shown. So yeah, and I think the hardship of doing so, as for sure as a Palestinian who live under the occupation in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, was always there. But and I mean, the organization and its people facing it since ever. But in the last year, we see a drastic change in the amount of violence that happens on the ground. It's not by chance. It happens because, as we understand it, because of the political support that this kind of to call it settler violence, again, you said it, it's not settler violence, it's a state violence. It's again, it's part of the logic of this regime. The apartheid used violence as a tool, as a main tool. In different ways, the army used the violence, settlers used violence against Palestinians, but the rise that we see in events and the amount of violence, I think it will be very hard to deny that it has to do with the fact that people that promote this violence are now sitting in the government, around the government table. So again, Ben-Gvir, he is settler violence, and he is now the person who is responsible for enforcing the law. It's absurd, and I think that almost natural, disastrous but natural outcome of it is that we see the rise of violence. And our workers also, I mean, B'Tselem people, workers and volunteers, not even as people of B'Tselem's people, just as Palestinians who live there are suffering like the rest of the Palestinians, but they are putting themselves in risk as they are approaching those, like doing their work, basically documenting, insisting of being there, of being in the field, suffering from both harassment from the army, from the authorities, and from settlers who are basically now roaming around the West Bank freely, much more violent actions than before, and much less, not that before it was good, but much and more, less and less, even the kind of facade or intention to force any kind of law over them. So in that sense, I think on a personal level, things are getting harder. On organizational level, for sure, things are getting harder. The challenges, it's not only the threats. I think that every organization work for human rights in Israel, Palestine, and for sure organizations work in the occupied territories are now in much bigger risk than before. In terms of legislation, in terms of, I mean, there are tons of things on the table that might happen. And I think there is something about this reality that is changing that also brings for us, some new challenges in a way that, a few years ago, we thought, I think most of us thought that if we'll fight it, we can stop it. I mean, we should keep fighting because something we can stop something terrible from happening. And to be realistic, if we look at the political situation, we're in a very asymmetric reality. It's not a fair fight, right? It's not that. So we need all the help we can get, especially, I think, from abroad, in order to put as much pressure as possible and to demand Israel to be accountable as much as we can. But to be realistic, these are a long process, right? It's not something that will happen in a day. And in a way, reality moves much, much, much faster. And that is, I think, that raises some really like deep and challenging question about the work that we are doing, because you are trying to do the best to help people on the ground. That's fine. But I think there is a developing understanding that part of what we should do is to explain the political context of what it is going on the ground. That even if we can't stop it, at least we should put this political price tag on it, and to put it in the right context. It's not what we see. Settler violence is not a local phenomenon that happens here and there and that works against the agenda of the Israeli regime. It is part of the agenda of the Israeli regime. It is part of a system that tries to clear as much space, as much land from Palestinians, and to kind of transfer them into specific areas in order to have this Jewish exclusive right over the entire land, right? So it is our, I think, obligation is to document, but also to analyze it and to try to explain it. Yeah, and maybe the last thing, I mean, another big, huge challenge, this kind of growing violent reality is bringing, I feel it personally, is how to recruit hope in this situation. Because, it's, again, you want to be hopeful, but you also want to be realistic. We have to be realistic about what we can do, about where we're heading. And I think it's not only about remembering that it will be good. I mean, we will get there. Finally, it's also about to kind of create hope in the struggle itself, in our obligation to do our best to change the situation, even if we can't fix it completely. But I'm saying it because I think, we're in a time where it gets harder and harder to be in this space.
To create hope in the struggle itself, I wanted to ask you. It's so interesting listening to you and speaking to you with the ways that you are weaving in the personal, the emotional, the political, and the state regime and the struggle all together. So when you joined B'Tselem a couple months ago, you published a letter. You sent a letter to B'Tselem supporters, and I want to quote a little bit from that and ask you about it. So this is what you wrote. You said, "In a few months, my partner Yaeli and I will become mothers. It's hard for me to grasp, but a moment will come when one child in this world, one creature, will be ours, and we will have to raise and protect him. Sadly, I know that my child will be born into a painful and cruel reality. My child will be born to live under apartheid, to be an occupier. The decision to bring a child into this place, into this world and this reality was not a given for us." And then you wrote that you joined B'Tselem because you want to do the best that you can Yuli, you said to, quote, turn this place into the home I wish for my child and for all the children who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, a home of justice and morality, values and freedom, a home free of oppression and discrimination, a home healing from occupation and apartheid. So you're tying your work with BLM directly into your role as a parent. And I wanted to ask, and now you've invited all of us listeners into that work with you, both from the letter you wrote, but also when you talk about what it looks like to create hope in the struggle. So can you just talk to us about what this vision, the connections between the specific work for human rights under this regime of oppression, and this is human rights, the primary victims of the violations of human rights are Palestinians, many of whom are your partners, many of whom you don't know and you'll never know, except for the ways in which their human rights are violated, and you're standing up for them. And also your vision as a parent, or a parent to be, God willing, and very, very soon.
Yeah. You know, in the simplest way, I think it's a very intuitive. It's almost banal to say it, but I think every parent wants to do its best to give his or her child to live in the, like, to give the best world that the child or her child can have. And in a sense, and I wrote it because I feel it. I want to do my best. I feel like on a personal, on a political level, on every level, I need to do my best in order to make sure, or try to make sure, that my child won't grow up to be an oppressor, or at least stop being one at some point of his life. I don't have another home. I mean, that's my home. Israel is my home. I don't want to leave it. I don't want to live anywhere else. But I want to live a just life, and yeah, for myself. So I mean it for myself, for my family, and for, I think it's part of we're part of something bigger than ourselves. So. But there is something else to it, I think, and that's part of a very personal journey I went through, is the understanding that part of what this sort of regimes, like the apartheid regime, is doing, is in a way separating us from who we really are. It's creating an environment in which we are being told a story about who we are, and we grow up to believe in it. In our case, in the Israeli case, it's a story full of fear. It's a story about being chased all the time, about the fact that we have to be strong and militant in order to survive. It's a story about substantial differences between some people and others, and you grow into that story. You don't have any, like, growing up in Israel, I didn't have any alternative, like, just to go beyond it and to start thinking something, to imagine a different future, is something that considers so radical, so, like, out of place, irresponsible, even, in a way. I mean, that's how far it goes. And I think part of the one of the outcome of this kind of mental state is that the political action is separated from the personal. I mean, there is something that is just doesn't work there. And I know, for me personally, while I was in Breaking the Silence and doing some political work, that's the way I experience things. I'm doing my political work, and there's Yuli, who is the private person, and there shouldn't be any connection between the two. And for sure, I don't need not to give time and not to give attention to what I'm going through, because I'm not the victim. It's not about me. Now, I'm really one of the privileged group, part of the privileged group in this system, no doubt at all. But I'm also living under this oppression. In a way that it plays with my mind, it controls my everyday life. It makes me being oppressor. It makes me be the Jewish person under Israeli apartheid, which is not something that I want. And I think in order to oppose this kind of mechanism, you have to, at least that's my understanding, I have to actively bring myself and the true self into the discussion. That's part of my political action, is to bring to oppose this kind of separation between the private and the political. And I'm doing it as a person, as a human, as an activist, as a woman, and soon as a parent. So that in itself, for me, is the most personal action and the most political action I can do at the same time.
Thank you for that clarity and for that vision, and in many ways for that, I think, inspiration and motivation. You've given me and I'm sure our listeners a lot to think about and to chew on. And I'm really grateful that you took time, when I know that time without this baby is short at this time, at this moment. And I really look forward to checking back in with you when you're back from parental leave, and wish you very well with this birth and the arrival of this baby, and very well with your work at B'Tselem, which is such a critically important organization fighting for everyone's right to be and bring their full selves into the world and into the political world, that everyone between the river and the sea may be able to have the birth and the child and the family that they want, free of oppression and violations. So thank you, Yuli, for taking time with us today.
Thank you.
And I want to thank our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast, for other great content related to Palestine and Israel. Subscribe to this podcast so you can stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. You can watch video versions of this podcast on YouTube. And thank you again, Yuli. Thank you to our listeners. And with that, I am Sarah Ann Minkin, signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts. Take care.